The night we fled the abandoned mental hospital was one I'll never forget. We ran through the foggy, rain-soaked streets, our hearts pounding, until we finally reached the safety of my house. My parents were asleep, and we didn't wake them. We were too shaken to explain what had happened, and honestly, I don't think they would have believed us. Instead, we sat in my room, whispering about what we'd seen, trying to make sense of it. The man's haunting grin and his eerie words, "You guys here for the feast?" played on a loop in my mind. Who was he? What was he doing in that abandoned building? And why had he been living there, surrounded by death and decay? These questions kept me awake for nights, but I didn't have the courage to go back and find answers. A year later, the police conducted a routine search of the area. They found the man. It turned out he had been a patient at the psych ward before it closed. After the facility shut down, he had been transferred to another institution but had escaped. He had been living in the abandoned building ever since, surviving by eating the wildlife around the complex. When the police found him, he was suffering from several diseases and conditions from eating raw meat. His mental state had deteriorated even further. There were rumors that he had killed someone in the forest while looking for food, but nothing was ever confirmed. The police didn't share many details with the public, but the little they did reveal was enough to send chills down my spine. I couldn't help but think about how close we had come to danger that night. If we hadn't run when we did, if we had stayed to investigate further, what would have happened to us? The experience left me with a deep sense of caution. I stopped exploring abandoned buildings altogether. The thrill of adventure no longer outweighed the risks. My friends felt the same way. We had been lucky, but we knew that luck could run out. The man in the green t-shirt became a cautionary tale, a reminder that some places are better left untouched. The incident at the abandoned mental hospital left me wary of exploring, but it didn't completely extinguish my curiosity. A year later, I was back home for the summer after starting university. Our house was just outside a small town, surrounded by dense forests. There was a small man-made lake nearby, diverted from a river that ran for miles through the woods. East of the lake, near my home, was a narrow grassy path that led to the river, following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I often took as a child. I knew the forest well and felt comfortable there. That summer, I decided to revisit the forest, partly out of nostalgia and partly to clear my head. The first time I went, I left in the morning and followed the path away from the stream to a sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. After about an hour, I reached the stream and knelt by the water, running my hands through it. The sound of the flowing water was soothing, but then I heard something else, a bell ringing in the distance. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, ringing fervently and periodically. I listened carefully, trying to figure out where it was coming from. At first, I thought it might be a lost hunting dog with a bell on its collar, but the sound was too heavy and resonant to be from a small bell. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started moving toward the sound, heading north. I know, it's the kind of decision that gets people killed in horror movies, but I was too intrigued to stop. As I walked, the bell seemed to move away from me, then stopped completely after about 5 minutes. I stood still listening, but the forest was silent again. The stream wasn't large or powerful enough to carry an object like a bell, and the river was still too far away. I considered every possibility. Wind chimes, a prank, even my imagination. But nothing explained the sound. The only logical conclusion was that it had to be a person. That thought made me uncomfortable, so I pushed it out of my mind and continued walking. Then I found the badger. It was dead, carefully decapitated. The body was fresh, still limp and without a smell, but the wound was crawling with maggots. It had clearly been killed with a knife. The bell sound had been following the stream, just as I had, which meant the badger had likely been placed there, possibly killed and decapitated, while I was walking in that direction. The thought disturbed me deeply. Someone had been in the forest with me, watching me, and I hadn't even realized it. I didn't stay in the forest much longer that day. The discovery of the badger and the eerie bell had unnerved me, and I decided to head home. A week later, I went back for the second time that summer, and the last time ever. The second time I ventured into the forest that summer, I left home around 6 o'clock in the evening. The sun was still up, but the shadows were growing longer, and the air had a crispness to it that hinted at the approaching night. I made it to the stream, and then walked to the river in about an hour. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, but as the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The once familiar woods started to feel alien, almost menacing. By the time I decided to head back, it was getting late, and the sky was darkening. The rain began to fall, a light drizzle at first, but it quickly grew heavier. The sound of rain on the trees was loud and surreal, muffling everything else around me. I walked as fast as I could, my head down, trying to navigate the uneven terrain. The forest was dense, and the rain made it harder to see, but I knew the path well, or so I thought. As I trotted through the clearest, most open part of the forest, I bumped into something heavy. The smell hit me first, sickening, putrid, and overwhelming. I looked up and froze. Hanging from a tree was the decomposing body of the badger I had found a week earlier. Its head had been tied to its front paws, and the way it was bound made the entire thing look like a grotesque, obscene display. Green liquid dripped from the carcass, and the stench was unbearable. I started gagging as mucus-like fluid dripped onto my hair. At first, I just stared at it in shock, unable to process what I was seeing. Then I began to fidget uncontrollably, feeling as though I was drenched in the creature's juices. I was already soaked from the rain, and my senses were overwhelmed and confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized something horrifying. I had walked the same path to get to the river. Someone had strung up the body after I had passed it on my way there. Someone knew I would see it. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't alone in the forest. Someone had been watching me, following me, and now they were sending me a message. I looked around, my heart racing, and started jogging. I was half running, half walking, trying to put as much distance between myself and the hanging badger as possible. The rain was still falling, and every sound was muffled, making it hard to tell if I was being followed. Then I heard it again. The bell. It rang much longer this time, on and off, and at one point, it felt like it was surrounding me. The fear combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't breathe properly made me lose my sense of direction slightly. I was heading southwest automatically, but I wasn't sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a horse, coughing and wheezing, almost crying out loud like a toddler. I tripped over leaves and twigs, trying to stay on the phone with my mom, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds but couldn't tell what they were. My mom was screaming on the phone, telling me they were on the path and that I needed to run. She said my dad had gotten out of the car and was heading east from the path bend. Terrified, I went into survival mode, half running and half speed walking because I was out of breath. Then I heard branches breaking and, for the first time, distinct footsteps coming from deeper in the forest. The bell was ringing louder. Against my better judgment, I looked over my shoulder. That's when I saw him, a tall figure creeping in my direction at the edge of the clearing, ringing the bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. I don't know if I had some hidden sprinting ability or if adrenaline gave me superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I didn't look back once. I screamed as loudly as I could, shouting, "I'm on the phone with the police and they're on the path. Dad, I can see you, I'm here." I wanted to scream, "Dad, please, where are you?" but kept that to myself. My voice echoed through the forest, but the rain and the dense trees seemed to swallow the sound. I felt like something awful was about to happen, like the man was right behind me, closing in. My mind raced, but my body moved on autopilot. I just ran. The forest was a blur of shadows and rain. My legs burned and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The bell was still ringing, but it was fading into the background, drowned out by the pounding of my heart and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't know if the man was still following me, but I didn't dare look back. I could only hear my heart pounding in my ears and the occasional snap of a branch behind me. I tripped over roots and rocks, my hands scraping against the rough bark of trees as I pushed myself forward. My phone was clutched tightly in my hand. The screen cracked from when I had dropped it earlier. My mom's voice was faint, but I could hear her shouting, "Keep running! We're almost there." I didn't know how close almost was, but I clung to those words like a lifeline. Then, finally, I heard my dad shouting my name. The intonation of his voice told me he could see me. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't slow down. I lunged at him as soon as we reached each other, nearly knocking him over. He grabbed my shoulders, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Are you okay? What happened?" he asked, but I could barely speak. I just nodded, gasping for air. My dad had heard the bell too, and he had seen the man in the distance. He didn't get a good look at him, but he knew something was wrong. My mom was waiting in the car, the engine running, ready to leave as fast as possible. We didn't waste any time. My dad helped me into the car, and we sped away, the headlights cutting through the rain and the darkness. As we drove, I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see the man standing at the edge of the forest, ringing that damn bell. But there was nothing, just the trees and the rain. My mom kept asking me questions, but I couldn't answer. I was too shaken, too exhausted. All I could think about was the man's grin, the way he had stared at me, and the sound of that bell. When we got home, my parents called the police. They came to the house and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. Without a clear description of the man or any evidence of a crime, they couldn't launch a full investigation. They promised to patrol the area more frequently, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. The man was still out there, somewhere in the forest, and I had no doubt he would come back. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, his grin, and the way he had looked at me. I heard the bell ringing in my ears even though I knew it was just my imagination. The forest. The days following the incident in the forest were a blur. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, and the fear lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. My parents were understandably worried, and they did their best to comfort me, but there was only so much they could do. The police had increased patrols in the area, but I knew that wouldn't stop the man if he was determined to come back. I spent most of my time indoors, avoiding the windows that faced the forest. Every sound, a creak in the floorboards, the wind rustling the trees, made me jump. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, his grin, and the way he had stared at me. The bell, too, haunted me. I could still hear it ringing in my mind, even though I knew it wasn't real. My parents tried to distract me, but nothing worked. I couldn't focus on anything except the fear that had taken root in my chest. I started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, convinced that the man was standing outside my window, ringing that damn bell. My mom would come into my room and sit with me until I fell back asleep, but the nightmares always returned. A week after the incident, the police called. They had found something in the forest, a makeshift campsite near the stream. There were signs that someone had been living there for a while. A tarp strung between trees, a fire pit, and scraps of food. They also found a bell, just like the one I had described. It was old and rusted, but it still worked. The police took it as evidence, but they didn't find any other clues about the man's identity or whereabouts. The discovery of the campsite only made me more anxious. It confirmed that the man was real, that he had been watching me, and that he had been living in the forest for who knows how long. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't run when I did. What if he had caught me? What if he had hurt me? The questions tormented me, and I couldn't find any answers. My parents suggested that I talk to someone, a counselor or a therapist, but I refused. I didn't want to relive the experience, not even in the safety of a therapist's office. Instead, I tried to bury the memories, to push them down and pretend they didn't exist. But the fear was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. As the weeks passed, the nightmares became less frequent, but they never completely went away. I started to feel a little more like myself, but I was different. I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I avoided the forest entirely, even though it had once been my favorite place. The thought of going back there filled me with dread. My parents did their best to help me move on, but they couldn't erase what had happened. The man in the forest had changed me, and I knew I would never be the same. The fear he had instilled in me was something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The incident in the forest had left me deeply scarred, but life had to go on. I returned to university, throwing myself into my studies and trying to distract myself from the lingering fear. The nightmares became less frequent, but they never completely went away. Every now and then, I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that the man with the bell was standing outside my window, watching me. During one of my visits back home, I decided to confront my fears. I didn't go back to the forest. I couldn't. But I did start talking about what had happened. I told my closest friends, and while they were supportive, they couldn't fully understand the depth of my fear. One of them, a guy named Terry who lived next door, suggested that we try to find out more about the man. Terry was a few years older than me and had always been the adventurous type. He thought that if we could uncover the truth, it might help me move on. I was hesitant at first, but Terry was persistent. He had grown up in the same small town and knew the forest almost as well as I did. He also had a car, which meant we could cover more ground and get away quickly if needed. After weeks of persuasion, I finally agreed. We planned to go during the day when the forest was less intimidating, and we promised each other that we would leave at the first sign of trouble. The day of our expedition was overcast, with a light drizzle that reminded me too much of the night I had encountered the man. Terry picked me up early in the morning, and we drove to the edge of the forest. We parked near the path that led to the stream, the same path I had taken that fateful day. My heart was pounding as we stepped out of the car, but Terry's confidence helped calm my nerves. We walked in silence, our footsteps crunching on the wet leaves. The forest was eerily quiet, as if it was holding its breath. Terry led the way, his eyes scanning the trees for any signs of movement. I stayed close behind him, my hand clutching a can of pepper spray. We reached the stream and followed it to the spot where I had found the badger. The carcass was gone, but the tree where it had been hanging was still there, its branches twisted and gnarled. Terry examined the area carefully, looking for any clues. He found a few scraps of fabric and some empty cans, but nothing that pointed to the man's identity. We continued deeper into the forest, following the stream until we reached the makeshift campsite the police had found. It was exactly as they had described: a tarp strung between trees, a fire pit, and scraps of food. The bell was gone, but the remnants of the man's presence were still there. As we searched the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man standing there grinning at me. Terry noticed my unease and suggested we head back. We had seen enough, and he didn't want to push our luck. We were about to leave when we heard it, the sound of a bell ringing in the distance. My blood ran cold, and Terry's eyes widened in alarm. We stood frozen for a moment, listening. The bell rang again, closer this time. Terry grabbed my arm and pulled me behind a tree, his finger pressed to his lips. We crouched there, our hearts pounding as the sound of footsteps approached. Through the trees, we saw him, a tall, lanky figure with a bell in his hand. He was wearing a tattered green t-shirt and torn pants, just like the man I had seen before. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see his grin, wide and menacing. He stopped a few feet away from us, ringing the bell slowly, as if he knew we were there. Terry tightened his grip on my arm, his eyes darting around for an escape route. The man took a step closer, and I felt a surge of panic. I clutched the pepper spray, ready to use it if he came any closer. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. We waited for what felt like an eternity before Terry finally let go of my arm. "We need to get out of here," he whispered. I nodded, too shaken to speak. We moved quickly but quietly, retracing our steps back to the car. The entire time, I kept expecting to hear the bell again, but the forest was silent. When we reached the car, Terry turned to me, his face pale. "We need to tell the police," he said. I agreed, but I knew it wouldn't do much good. The man was a ghost, a shadow in the forest who could disappear at will. The police had already searched the area and found nothing. What more could they do? We drove back to my house in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. Terry dropped me off and promised to call me later. I went inside, my mind racing. The man was still out there, and I had no doubt he would come back. The forest, once a place of comfort and familiarity, had become a nightmare. I knew I would never go back there again. The encounter in the forest with Terry had left me more shaken than I cared to admit. Seeing the man again, hearing that bell, and feeling his presence so close had reignited the fear I had tried so hard to bury. Terry and I reported the incident to the police, but as I had suspected, there wasn't much they could do. They increased patrols in the area, but the man was elusive, a shadow in the woods who seemed to vanish whenever anyone got too close. For weeks, I avoided the forest entirely. I stayed indoors, focusing on my studies and trying to distract myself from the lingering fear. But the nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than ever. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that the man was standing outside my window ringing that damn bell. My parents did their best to comfort me, but there was only so much they could do. Then one night, something happened that changed everything. I was home alone, my parents having gone out for the evening. It was late, and the house was quiet except for the sound of the wind rustling the trees outside. I was sitting in the living room, trying to focus on a book when I heard it, the faint sound of a bell ringing in the distance. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I knew it wasn't my imagination. I grabbed my phone and called Terry, my hands trembling so badly I could barely dial the number. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Terry, he's here," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I can hear the bell." Terry was wide awake in an instant. "Stay inside. Lock the doors. I'm on my way." I did as he said, locking every door and window in the house. The bell was still ringing, louder now, and I could hear footsteps outside. My heart was pounding, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I grabbed a kitchen knife and stood in the middle of the living room, my eyes fixed on the front door. The bell stopped abruptly, and the silence was almost worse. I held my breath, listening for any sound. Then I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and saw him. The man was standing outside, his face pressed against the glass, grinning at me. His eyes were wild, and his teeth were bared in a grotesque smile. He raised his hand and tapped on the window again, the sound echoing through the silent house. I screamed and backed away, clutching the knife. The man's grin widened, and he started to laugh, a low guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. He moved to the front door and began to rattle the handle, trying to force his way in. I could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and menacing. "You can't hide from me," he said. "I've been watching you. I've been waiting." I backed into the corner of the room, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. The man was stronger than me, and I knew I couldn't fight him off. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't have time. The man was already inside. The front door burst open with a loud crash, and the man stepped inside, his eyes locked on me. He was holding the bell in one hand, and in the other, he held a knife. His grin was wider than ever, and his eyes were filled with a madness that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You shouldn't have tried to find me." I raised the knife, my hands trembling. "Stay back," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll kill you if you come any closer." The man laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think you can stop me?" he said. "You're just a little girl. You can't stop me." He took a step closer, and I swung the knife, aiming for his chest. But he was faster than I expected. He grabbed my wrist and twisted it, forcing me to drop the knife. I cried out in pain, but he didn't let go. He pulled me closer, his breath hot on my face. "You're mine now," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You've always been mine." I struggled against him, but he was too strong. I could feel his grip tightening, his fingers digging into my skin. I was trapped, and I knew there was no way out. Then, I heard a loud crash, and the man's grip loosened. I looked up and saw Terry standing in the doorway, a baseball bat in his hands. He had smashed the window and climbed inside, and now he was standing there, his eyes filled with rage. "Get away from her," Terry said, his voice low and menacing. The man turned to face him, his grin widening. "You think you can stop me?" he said. "You're just a boy. You can't stop me." Terry didn't hesitate. He swung the bat, aiming for the man's head. The man dodged, but Terry was faster. He swung again, and this time he connected. The man stumbled back, clutching his head, and Terry didn't give him a chance to recover. He swung the bat again and again, until the man was on the ground, unconscious. I stood there trembling as Terry dropped the bat and pulled me into his arms. "It's okay," he said, his voice soothing. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." The police arrived soon after, and they took the man into custody. He was identified as a former patient at the mental hospital, someone who had escaped years ago and had been living in the forest ever since. He was charged with multiple crimes, including assault and trespassing, and he was sent to a high-security facility where he couldn't hurt anyone else. The nightmare was finally over, but the scars remained. I would never forget the man with the bell, the way he had stared at me and the fear he had instilled in me. But I also knew that I had faced him, and I had survived. The forest, once a place of comfort and familiarity, had become a nightmare. But I had faced that nightmare and come out stronger. The man with the bell was finally behind bars, but the scars he left behind were deep. The weeks following the confrontation were a blur of police interviews, therapy sessions, and restless nights. Terry stayed by my side through it all, his presence a constant source of comfort. He had saved my life, and I would never forget that. The police uncovered more about the man's past. His name was James Holloway, and he had been a patient at the mental hospital before it closed. He had a history of violent behavior and had escaped from a different facility years ago. The makeshift campsite in the forest had been his home for a long time, and the bell was something he had taken from the hospital, a relic of his twisted mind. The discovery of his identity brought some closure, but it didn't erase the fear. I still had nightmares, still woke up in a cold sweat, convinced that he was standing outside my window. The sound of a bell, even in my dreams, sent me into a panic. My therapist helped me work through the trauma, but it was a slow process. I had to learn how to live with what had happened, how to move forward. Terry and I grew closer in the aftermath. He had been my rock, my protector, and I couldn't imagine going through it all without him. We spent hours talking about what had happened, trying to make sense of it. He never pushed me to talk about things I wasn't ready to, but he was always there to listen when I needed him. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the sunset, Terry turned to me and said, "You're stronger than you think, you know. What you went through, most people wouldn't have survived that. But you did. You faced him, and you came out on the other side." I smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. "I don't feel strong," I admitted. "I feel broken, like he took something from me that I'll never get back." Terry reached over and took my hand. "He didn't take anything from you," he said firmly. "You're still here, you're still you, and that's what matters." His words stayed with me, a small glimmer of hope in the darkness. I knew I had a long way to go, but I also knew I wasn't alone. Terry was there, my family was there, and I had the strength to keep going. As the months passed, the nightmares became less frequent. I started to feel like myself again, though I was different. The experience had changed me, but it hadn't broken me. I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, but I was also more resilient. I had faced my worst fear and come out the other side. The forest, once a place of comfort and familiarity, remained a place I avoided. I couldn't bring myself to go back there. Not yet. But I knew that one day, I would. I would face it again, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The man with the bell had tried to take my sense of safety, But he hadn't succeeded. I had reclaimed it, piece by piece. Terry and I continued to grow closer, and eventually, our friendship blossomed into something more. He was my protector, my confidant, and my partner. Together, we faced the challenges that came our way, and I knew that no matter what, I could count on him. The man with the bell was gone, but his memory lingered. I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew that I had the strength to move forward. The forest, once a place of fear, would one day be a place of healing. And when that day came, I would be ready. The months following the final confrontation with James Holloway were a journey of healing and self-discovery. While the physical threat was gone, the emotional scars remained. I had to learn how to live with the trauma, how to rebuild my sense of safety, and how to trust the world again. It wasn't easy, but with the support of Terry, my family, and my therapist, I began to find my footing. Therapy became a crucial part of my life. My therapist, Dr. Ellis, was patient and understanding, helping me unpack the layers of fear and anxiety that had taken root in my mind. We worked on grounding techniques to help me manage panic attacks and strategies to reframe my thoughts when the nightmares crept in. Slowly but surely, I began to feel more in control. One of the hardest parts of the healing process was confronting the forest. For months, I avoided it entirely, taking long detours to avoid even driving past it. But Dr. Ellis encouraged me to face it, not as a place of fear, but as a place of strength. "You survived there," she reminded me. "It's a part of your story, but it doesn't define you." Terry offered to go with me when I was ready. He understood my hesitation, but also knew that avoiding the forest forever wasn't the answer. "We'll take it slow," he said. "Just a walk, nothing more. You set the pace." It took weeks for me to work up the courage, but one crisp autumn morning, I decided it was time. Terry and I drove to the edge of the forest, the same path I had taken so many times before. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, their leaves crunching underfoot as we walked. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and earth. At first, every sound made me jump. A rustling in the bushes, a bird taking flight, the distant call of a crow. Terry stayed close, his presence a steady anchor. We walked in silence, letting the forest speak for itself. As we moved deeper, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the gentle babble of the stream, the quiet beauty of the place. We reached the spot where I had found the badger, the tree where it had been hung. The memory was still vivid, but it didn't hold the same power over me. I knelt by the stream, running my fingers through the cold water, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected. The forest wasn't the enemy. It was just a place where something terrible had happened, but also a place where I had found my strength. Terry stood nearby, giving me space but staying close enough to offer support. "How are you feeling?" he asked after a while. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. "Better," I said. "It's not as scary as I thought it would be." He smiled, a small, proud smile. "You're braver than you give yourself credit for." We stayed in the forest for a while longer, walking slowly and taking in the sights and sounds. It wasn't a perfect experience. There were moments when the old fear crept in, when I felt the urge to turn and run, but I pushed through it. By the time we left, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I had faced the forest, and I had come out stronger. The healing process wasn't linear. There were days when the fear felt overwhelming, when the nightmares returned, and when I questioned whether I would ever feel truly safe again. But there were also days of progress, small victories that reminded me of how far I had come. Terry and I continued to grow closer, our bond strengthened by the shared experience. He never pushed me to talk about things I wasn't ready to, but he was always there to listen when I needed him. His unwavering support became a cornerstone of my recovery. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the stars, I turned to him and said, "Thank you for everything. I don't think I could have gotten through this without you." He smiled, his hand finding mine. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're okay." I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew I wasn't alone. I had faced my worst fear and come out the other side. The man with the bell was gone, and I was still here, still standing. The forest, once a place of fear, was slowly becoming a place of healing. I knew I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew that I had the strength to move forward. The scars remained, but they were a testament to my resilience, a reminder that I had survived. As the seasons changed, so did I. The healing process was slow, but with each passing day, I felt a little more like myself. The nightmares became less frequent, and the fear that had once consumed me began to fade. The forest, once a place of terror, became a symbol of my resilience. I didn't visit it often, but when I did, it was on my terms. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. Terry and I continued to grow closer, our relationship deepening with each shared experience. He had been my rock through the darkest moments, and now he was my partner in building a brighter future. We spent our days exploring new places, creating new memories, and leaving the shadows of the past behind. One weekend, Terry suggested we take a trip to the mountains. "It'll be good for us," he said. "A change of scenery, some fresh air, and a chance to just be." I agreed, eager for a break from the routines that had become my lifeline. We packed our bags and drove to a small cabin nestled in the foothills. The air was crisp and clean, the mountains towering in the distance. It was a world away from the forest that had haunted me, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. We spent the days hiking, exploring the trails, and taking in the breathtaking views. The mountains were vast and wild, but they didn't feel threatening. They felt alive, full of beauty and wonder. Terry and I laughed and talked, our conversations easy and light. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Terry turned to me and said, "I've been thinking about us, about the future." I looked at him, my heart skipping a beat. "What about it?" He took my hand, his expression serious but kind. "I love you," he said, "and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I know we've been through a lot, but I think we're stronger because of it. I want to build a life with you, a life full of love and adventure and peace." Tears filled my eyes as I squeezed his hand. "I love you too," I said, "and I want that life with you, more than anything." He smiled, a smile that lit up his entire face, and pulled me into his arms. We sat there by the fire, wrapped in each other's warmth, and I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. The future was uncertain, but it was ours, and we would face it together. When we returned home, we began making plans for our future. We talked about where we wanted to live, the kind of life we wanted to build, and the dreams we wanted to chase. It was exciting and terrifying all at once, but it was also empowering. We were taking control of our lives, shaping them into something beautiful. The forest, once a place of fear, became a distant memory. I didn't forget what had happened, but I no longer let it define me. I had faced my worst fear and come out the other side. I had found love, strength, and a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. One day, as Terry and I were walking through town, we passed by a small shop with a bell hanging above the door. The sound made me pause, but it didn't fill me with fear. Instead, it reminded me of how far I had come. The man with the bell was gone, and I was still here, still standing. Terry noticed my hesitation and squeezed my hand. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, a small smile on my lips. "Yeah, I'm okay." And for the first time in a long time, I truly meant it. The journey to healing wasn't linear, but with time, I found myself growing stronger. The nightmares became rare, and the fear that had once consumed me began to fade. Terry and I continued to build our life together, finding joy in the small moments and strength in each other. The forest, once a place of terror, became a distant memory, a chapter in my life that I had closed but not forgotten. One day, as I was sorting through old boxes in the attic, I came across a small rusted bell. It was the same one I had seen in the forest, the one that had haunted my dreams. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, and for a moment, the old fear crept in. But then I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I was no longer that scared girl in the woods. I was stronger now, braver. I showed the bell to Terry that evening. He looked at it with a mix of curiosity and concern. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. I thought for a moment, then smiled. "I'm going to let it go." The next day we drove to the forest. It was a crisp autumn morning, the trees ablaze with color. We walked the familiar path, the crunch of leaves underfoot a comforting sound. When we reached the stream, I knelt by the water and placed the bell on the ground. "This is where it ends," I said, my voice steady. "This is where I let go." Terry stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder. "You're amazing, you know that?" I smiled up at him, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you for everything." We stayed by the stream for a while, letting the quiet beauty of the forest wash over us. The bell remained on the ground, a symbol of the past, but it no longer held power over me. I had faced my fears, and I had come out stronger. As we walked back to the car, I felt a sense of closure. The forest, once a place of fear, was now a place of healing. The man with the bell was gone, and I was still here, still standing. The future was uncertain, but it was ours, and we would face it together. The scars remained, but they were a testament to my resilience, a reminder that I had survived. And as I looked at Terry, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, with love and strength.